Spitfires and Bf109s are probably some of the most popular subjects for scale model aircraft builders. And it goes without surprise that any new company may want to start with some of these in their range, and that's exactly what Beacon Models did quite recently. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me as I build and review the Supermarine Spitfire Mark I and Messerschmitt Bf109E Dogfight Set from Beacon Models. For a deeper dive inside the box of this particular kit, check out the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on this topic. In this video, I'm going to be focusing on what this kit is like to build and rounding off with a review at the end. As normal, I'll pop a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy having a go at something like this for yourself. As a small note, I did actually build a pre-production sample of this kit some years ago, and they have addressed the issues that I highlighted in that particular video. But without any further ado, let's get into this. As normal, I'll be cutting the parts away from the sprue using my side cutters and then sanding down any rough plastic or flash. There is a tiny amount of flash in a few places here and there, but nothing that isn't too unmanageable. As there are both a Spitfire and a 109 kit inside the boxing, I'll be building these simultaneously. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice throughout this build, and I started off by assembling the various cockpit components. There aren't that many parts that make up each respective cockpit for each model, but the details are generally quite nice for such a small scale. Unfortunately, there are no pilot figures included in the kit. However, Beacon Models have designed standalone pilot figures which can be purchased as 3D printed parts from their website, not only in standing orientation but also in a seated position ready to fly the relevant aircraft. With both cockpits now assembled, they need a lick of paint. For the Spitfire, I've gone with this Humbrol 78, which is a RAF cockpit green kind of colour. This was painted straight out of the bottle with no thinning. For the Bf109, I've opted to go for this Humbrol number 240, which is an RLM 02 grey colour. Once again, this was also painted straight out of the bottle with no thinning. After that, some Humbrol number 33, which is a matte black colour, would be used to paint the control panels and other various select details within the cockpit of both models. And then, when that was done, I decided to join the fuselage halves together. This is relatively straightforward and the fit is pretty good for both kits. The wings for both aircraft come as single pieces, and it's relatively straightforward to join the fuselage onto them. You do actually get alternative wings for different variants, but those ones are not used in this particular kit. However, they will be used in other boxings. The horizontal tail surfaces can then be glued into their slots on the side of the tail. The Spitfire is relatively straightforward, but the 109 has slightly more complexity as it does require the installation of some tiny support struts, which I found to be a little fiddly, but with some patience and care, you can get them in the right place. After this, on the nose of the Bf109, a little bit more complex than the Spitfire, the main engine cowling also has to be installed. Turning my attention to the undersides of the models, some air intakes and radiators need to be added. The Spitfire has 3 components which are glued on here, whilst the Bf109 has 2. The engine exhausts for the Spitfire were then glued onto the sides of the nose. The Bf109 doesn't need this doing as they are pre-moulded onto that kit. I do, however, want to install the landing gear legs at this point, and they come as single parts with the landing gear leg and the doors moulded together. This was easy enough to do by popping them in the correct holes on the bottom of the aircraft. It is worth noting that a raised landing gear option is also included in the kit. Flipping both aircraft over to the other side, they both have aerial masts which need to be installed into some holes at the top of the aircraft. This was relatively straightforward, and then this was followed by the installation of the clear cockpit glazing. I didn't have any problems with the fit here, and I used a tiny amount of the Tamiya Extra Thin to hold them in place. Fortunately, this kit does come complete with pre-cut canopy masks for both aircraft. These are manufactured by Pwit and are to a good quality. These are some pretty minute pieces of tape which need to be applied. That being said though, I found that this was a much better way of doing things rather than having to make my own masks out of tape. So this was a very nice inclusion. I could now turn my attention to assembling the props. Both of them come in a very similar way, typically with the spinner being added over the top of the propeller. Interestingly, you do get a blank spinner included if you'd like to display the aircraft kind of with the prop spinning. There is no clear plastic disc or anything like that, so you would have to source one and manufacture one yourself, but Beacon models have thought about this display option. And now it's time to prime. I've decided I'm going to go with this Humbrol No. 1 grey primer from a rattle can. This would be sprayed over both aircraft and the remaining parts which are yet to be added onto the models. I've decided that I'm going to hand paint the kits after this point, and this primer should give a nice base layer for these paints to stick to. And for this painting, I'm just going to flip-flop between the two aircraft as I go, purely because I would be waiting for one paint to dry and then I would move on to the next one. So the first one is Humbrol 34, which is a white colour, and this was painted onto the tips of the Bf109's wings. I'd also paint this onto the spinner for the 109. Whilst that's drying, Humbrol 90, which is a sky type colour, is painted onto the lower side of the Spitfire. A couple of thin coats might be needed in order to get a good level of opacity, and if I do add any thinner it will actually just be water just to help it flow a little. 65, which is an aircraft blue, would be used as the lower side colour for the Bf109. Turning my attention to the top sides of the aircraft when that was all dry, Humbrol 29 Dark Earth will be the first colour on the Spitfire. Whilst RLM 02, which is a grey colour, would be the first colour on the Bf109. You'll notice on the Bf109 that I have actually masked the wingtips and the fuselage sides that need to stay the relevant colour. Humbrol 116, which is a US dark green, was used to carefully replicate the RAF camouflage scheme on the upper surfaces of the Spitfire. I did this by hand, taking time just to kind of make it look right. I decided to go for this shade of green because I quite like it, but of course you could use the more traditional number 30 instead. For the other colour on the Bf109's paint scheme, I've gone for Humbrol 242, which is an RLM 71 dark green. Again, this was painted on by hand, but it doesn't have wavy lines, so I'm trying to make these lines as straight as possible. Of course, it may have been slightly easier to mask this to get a neater edge, but I'm generally quite happy with how this looks in the end. When that was done, I carefully removed the masking tape from the Bf109, and there are only a few little areas that will need a little touching up due to some paint bleed. And with that paint now all applied, I'm going to clear gloss both of the aircraft. This clear gloss should create a nice smooth finish in preparation for the decals shortly. This clear gloss was simply painted straight out of the bottle. As mentioned, this kit features cartograph decals, so they are printed to a really nice quality, and I cut them into more manageable pieces. These were then soaked in warm water to allow them to separate from the backing paper. Microscale, set and sol will be my setting solutions during this build, and first up the micro set from the blue bottle will be painted onto the relevant areas of the kits, and then after the decals have been applied and allowed to soften, the micro sol from the red bottle will be further applied to help soften them even further into the surface details. I didn't experience any problems during the decal application process and found it to be a relatively straightforward step. Perhaps the only thing I would mention is that because of the small scale, there are some pretty small and fiddly transfers to apply. These kits do feature a reasonably comprehensive amount of stencils and things, which also need to be applied. So I just had to take my time and be a little bit more careful with this particular part of the process. You do only get the one paint scheme for each aircraft in this particular kit, but if you wanted to make up your own kind of paint scheme, Beacon models do actually have aftermarket extras featuring more generic markings, which you could use for a more personalised paint scheme. With the decals now applied and completely cured, a further coat of the clear gloss varnish would be applied over the top in order to seal them in and protect them from the next steps. And speaking of the next steps, a little light weathering. I've got this Humbrol blue-grey enamel wash and I thinned it down with some white spirit. I find that the wash is just too kind of vibrant and I want a much more subdued effect, so thinning it down should provide this. Once I'd reached a colour that I was happy with, it would be painted onto both of the aircraft and allowed to run into the recessed details and try and highlight them a little bit. The benefit of that gloss coat which I applied earlier is that it should help this wash run into all the recessed details and protect those transfers. Whilst that is drying, Humbrol 33 makes a reappearance here and was used to paint the propeller and spinner for the Spitfire. It would also be used on the wheels. This RLM 70 colour would be used for the blades of the 109's propeller. You'll notice that I've already painted the black triangles on the spinner, which I did using the black paint and just took time to do this carefully with a fine brush. Humbrol 99, which is a lemon colour, would be used on the tips of the Spitfire's propeller just to highlight the dangerous areas when this is spinning. A free sample that I've been given to try out are these metallic markers from Gallery. I'm going to use the aluminium one to very carefully pick out the landing gear legs and also the hubs on the Spitfire's wheels. This red copper colour would be very carefully applied onto the engine exhausts on the Spitfire, and then I would try the gunmetal one on the cannon barrels on the Bf109. Now I'm going to glue on the wheels onto the landing gear legs. They do have a flattened edge, so I need to make sure I get this lined up with the ground. This just helps to give the impression of weight pushing through the tyres. And with that, I'm going to give them both a coat of this Humbrol 49, which is a matte varnish. A few even coats of this should help dull down all that gloss that I previously applied and give a nice uniform finish. I then added the propellers onto the nose of each respective plane, and then carefully peeled away the canopy masks from both aircraft. And with that, I'm going to call my build of the Bf109 and Spitfire Mark I in 144th scale from Beacon Models complete. And that's another build under the belt. Well, technically it's kind of two builds, but you know, they are really small, so I'm going to count it as one. I actually really enjoyed building these little kits. I didn't find them to be overly complex, and the level of detail and fit of the parts was really quite good for such small subjects. There are a few little bits of flash here and there, and a few little milling marks left over from when the toolings were manufactured, which might be slightly noticeable on some of the parts, but they could be sanded off with a little bit of care. This kit dates from 2022, but I don't think we actually saw it being sent out until 2023, although technically I think the design work and the tooling were generated around 2021, but you know, things take a bit of time to be created. Since then though, there has been another release of these kits in different paint schemes and also other releases as different variants. As I mentioned earlier on, there are parts included for different variants of the Spitfire and 109 in the set, and those are explored in different boxings. I do keep a note of everything that I do in one of my journals, and these journals are available on Amazon, and you can keep a log of your own builds inside of them. In here I've written down that I took about 5 days to complete this, as I must have been fitting it around other commitments. However, I do think that you could realistically complete both of these kits within a weekend if you wanted to do so. I found the included paint schemes not particularly difficult to replicate, but I think masking some of the camouflage schemes, particularly on the 109, may have resulted in slightly neater edges. The decals, however, being printed by Cartograph, are to a really nice quality and applied to the models with no problems. The included canopy masks are a great feature as well, and certainly made painting these kits much easier. At the time I was making this video, the kit was retailing for £21.95, which you might think is a little bit expensive for two tiny little kits, but then you are getting two kits and the Cartograph transfers and the canopy masks as well. This is the first outing from Beacon Models, and if kits like this sell successfully for them, they'll be able to explore other subjects in the same scale, and perhaps even other subjects in other scales. I know they have plans for the future to replicate other aircraft which saw service with both sides during the Battle of Britain, so I'll drop a link underneath the video to their website if you'd like to keep up to date with those developments. Additionally, don't take just my word for it. It's always worth getting a second opinion, and I would highly recommend this amazing build of the Bf109 from LPJ Models. In this video he explores the kit in a completely different way that I have, and really makes an incredible little project out of this kit. For me though, I'm pretty happy with this build, and I will be exploring some more of these kits in the future, so make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss that one. But yeah, I think it's time to wrap this one up. These are some decent little kits, which I thoroughly enjoyed and look forward to experiencing more of in different ways in the future. As always, a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them, take a look at the links in the description. I'd like to welcome our latest member to the club, and that is Christoph. Thanks for joining us. There are other ways to help support the channel as well, and again, full information is below the video. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you again on the workbench next time.